Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Brandon Minnick, and in this session, we'll be talking about building GraphQL APIs in C#. I'm so excited to be with you here today because I first learned about GraphQL just a couple years ago, and I remember the first time I got to sit in a session just like this and learn about it, my mind was blown. I was so impressed by how amazing GraphQL is, and just can't wait to share that with you today. GraphQL is a really amazing technology that I truly believe this is the future of building APIs. So kind of like how today everything or most things are built in REST, and if a fellow developer came to you and said, "Hey, can you help me build this API? I'm trying to build it in SOAP using XML," you'd be like, "SOAP? Why are you building a SOAP API?" I truly believe in a couple years from now, we'll be saying the same thing about REST versus GraphQL. So in, say, 5 to 10 years, somebody will come to you on your team and say, "Hey, can you help me out? I'm working on this REST API endpoint." And you're like, "REST? Why are you doing it in REST? Let's do it in GraphQL." Because it is an insanely powerful technology. And what's interesting is it's already being used by millions of developers around the world. Big companies like Netflix, Uber, Airbnb, Github are all already using GraphQL, but they're doing it all in JavaScript. GraphQL still hasn't really taken a foothold in the C# world yet. So just by joining me today and hanging out in this session, we are literally at the forefront of this GraphQL movement in C# in .NET, and truly will be the leaders on our teams and our communities helping to get these started. Because, like I said, the .NET community hasn't really embraced GraphQL yet, but we will. So before we get started today, I want to point out 2 links that you'll see on the bottom of just about every slide today. On the bottom left, this is my Twitter handle. This is the best way to reach me. You can find me on Twitter at @TheCodeTraveler. So if you have any questions, if you want to chat about C# stuff, GraphQL stuff, my messages are always open. I'm actually a mobile developer by trade. I build iOS and Android apps in C# using Xamarin and .NET MAUI. And we'll explain more why I love GraphQL so much as a client-side developer in just a bit. And then here on the bottom right, this is my website, and I built a web page just for us, just for today's session. So this is where you can find everything. Don't worry about memorizing anything today. Just make sure you grab this link at some point. So grab it, take a picture of your phone, bookmark it. You can share it with your friends, your colleagues, because this is where you can find everything from today's session. So everything from the slides, I'll be posting a link to the recording once we've got it up on YouTube. The code we're going to be doing today, I have that already done and saved in GitHub, so I've got links to that, as well as GraphQL workshops, and also more resources on GraphQL that you can use to help you get started on your journey. So what is GraphQL? In its most basic sense, it's a graph query language. That's quite literally what GraphQL stands for. But really what it is it essentially inverts how we think of our APIs. So today, for example, as a mobile developer, I rely on REST APIs to give me data, and also for me to update things on the server. And so the backend teams, they've built out a bunch of REST APIs that I can use to, say, retrieve data about a user. So I could call my user API, and that will always give me back the same DTO, that same C# model, the same properties and fields. But depending on the user I ask for, maybe I input a different user's ID, I'll get different information back, but that model is always going to be the same from that same REST API endpoint. Likewise, if I want to change anything server-side, there's a specific API for that. So with REST, I make a post request or an update request or whatever it might be to update something server-side, and that REST API only does that one thing. So if I want to update a user's email address, I'll have to send a post request to the API that can do that. And if I want to do anything else, we got to build a whole nother REST API. And usually that's not too bad, especially if I'm working by myself. I've got a couple apps in the App Store that I've built both the mobile side and the back-end side for, so it's really easy for me to do that. But in reality, we work on teams, and building a new REST API endpoint for something we need in our mobile apps means that, well, we got to open up a ticket with our back-end team. They add it to their backlog. Eventually, they get around to creating that new API endpoint in a couple weeks. It'll make its way to QA and then prod, and then finally, I can consume that API and leverage it in my mobile app. With GraphQL, we're flipping that model all the way around. The way GraphQL works is from the client side, I can request anything I want. I basically tell the GraphQL endpoint exactly what I want, what I need, and it sends it back to me. And so with GraphQL, there's no wasted data. There's no wasted round trips back and forth to the server. It's a lot more efficient. And in terms of just velocity, developer velocity, right? Now everything's there. It's just waiting for me to ask for it. And I don't have to wait on my back-end team to build out new APIs and test them and get them to the production servers before we can finally add these features to our mobile app. So let's go back, because to really understand GraphQL, it's helpful to know where it came from. So let's go back to the year 2012. It's crazy to think that was almost a decade ago. But in 2012 was when Facebook launched their first native mobile app. Facebook always had a web app before then, but in around the 2012 timeframe, they said, you know what? I think this iOS and Android thing is here to stay. We should probably make an app for it. And they did. And Facebook launched the app to the App Store, and it just got slammed in reviews. Tons of one-star reviews, two-star reviews. If anybody here was on Facebook using the mobile app at that time, you probably remember the Facebook app was really slow. It took forever to load. It would burn through your mobile data plan because it was just pulling in so much data. And then at the same time, your CPU's running full throttle, so your phone's overheating, your battery's draining. And that was all the reviews in the App Store, because the Facebook app has a lot of data. I mean, what is Facebook without data, right? So they kind of needed to do that. And you can look at these screenshots that I've posted here. These are screenshots from my Facebook page. And just thinking about all this data that loads, just when I launch the app, just when I tap that button on the home screen, I get information about, let's see, this is the news feed here on the left. So I get my newsfeed updates from my friends about, there's my friend taking his son to get donuts in the morning. And so there's the picture, there's a date timestamp, there's his name, his profile picture. Above that are the Facebook stories. So again, with their profile pictures and their usernames and the videos embedded there. And what also loads when you launch the app is the notifications page. And so even more data comes in on this notifications page. So information about my buddy Jeff getting married, and I've got an event coming up called Taco Week, and there's even friends that I might know. Facebook, wants to keep you on the platform, so they want to connect you with more people. And so here's people I don't even know that they're saying, you might know this person, and here's how many mutual friends you have in common. And all this data is being downloaded as soon as you launch the app on your phone. And so it's really no surprise that when Facebook first pushed this mobile app to the app stores, that it started burning through people's cellular data plans. It started really burning through people's batteries because the CPUs got to process and display all this information. And when you think about it, from the lens of REST, it makes a lot of sense. So what's going to happen when I launch the app, right? The Facebook app's going to first hit one REST API /user/ID. So it's going to pull down information about me. And then once it has that information, then it can go to the next API and pull down information about my upcoming events. And it can go to another API and pull information about my friends. And then once it has the data back from those APIs, it can make another API call. So for each friend request, it's got to then make a user request for that person and get their profile information and their how many friends we have in common. And so what we get with REST APIs is this cascading API requests. You start with one or two, but then you have other API requests that depend on the data that comes back, and then you might have another API request to make that depends on the data that comes back from that. So you kind of get this pyramid shape of API requests. And this is really why the Facebook app struggled, because each API request means it's going from my phone to the server, back to my phone, that round trip, even if it only takes 10, 30 milliseconds. If we have dozens, if not hundreds of API requests that are launching and dependent on each other when the app opens, well, those really start to add up. And so the developers at Facebook were thinking about this, and they're like, there's got to be a better way. And that's when they came up with the idea for GraphQL. So quick aside, yes, I did just say Facebook invented GraphQL. That was back in 2012. But today, GraphQL is owned by what's known as the GraphQL Foundation. So a lot of us here, if we're C# developers, might be familiar with the .NET Foundation. .NET Foundation is a not-for-profit that helps to curate, sponsor open source C# projects, specifically popular NuGet packages that we might all use in our apps, that if the developer decided to stop working on them one day, then we'd all be kind of hosed. The .NET Foundation supports all those projects. Likewise with the GraphQL Foundation. So the GraphQL Foundation, again, not-for-profit, it controls and iterates on the GraphQL spec, so GraphQL is constantly improving, and they're also the ones that kind of shepherd and help sustain the GraphQL libraries, like for all sorts of different programming languages from React to C#. So if you don't like Facebook, don't worry. You don't have to rely on them for your GraphQL technology anymore, because it's all in the hands of the GraphQL Foundation. But right, so the engineers at Facebook looked at that problem they had with making all these cascading REST API calls, pulling in all this data, some of which they're using, some of which they're throwing away, and they said, there's got to be a better way. So they consolidated everything down to one GraphQL API endpoint. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute. This API endpoint has to then return all the data? Facebook has an insane amount of data. They probably have petabytes of data, if not more. So how do you get all that data back from one API call? And even if it's just scoped to the user, I've been on Facebook for over a decade. That would still be probably gigs worth of data coming back from this one API call, even if it was just scoped to me. Well, the way GraphQL works is we reach out to, or when we make that request to the GraphQL API, we specify exactly what we want. So take a look at this example query and response. On the left, I tell the Facebook API exactly what I want. So I say that I want to get information about a user. So I pass in that user's ID. And then I say I want to know that user's name and the upcoming events count. And also for that user, show me some friend suggestions. In this case, just give me one. Give me the first one. And for that friend, let me know that person's name and how many mutual friends we have in common. And so I send that to the GraphQL API endpoint, and what comes back is this JSON response. Now, this is the same JSON that we know and love. It's the same JSON that we use in REST. So if you know how to consume a JSON payload, deserialize it using either system.text.json or newtonsoft.json into C#, then you already know how to handle the GraphQL response, which is really nice. So the learning curve handling these responses, super low, because it's the same thing that we would get back from a REST API. But look at the data that came back. It's exactly the data that I asked for. There's no more data in there. There's no less data. If we look at it, it gives me the username, which is me, Brandon Minnick. It shows me that I have 4 upcoming events or 4 upcoming events. And then for the one friend suggestion, it lets me know that, hey, there's another guy on Facebook, his name's Seth Juarez, and you have 18 mutual friends. Maybe you should reach out. So what we get here is one round trip. So I don't have to make multiple API calls to the server. I don't have to, like we had to in REST, first hit this one API endpoint to get information about me, the user, and then hit another API endpoint to get information about the mutual friends. And so we can do this all in one round trip, one payload, and we're not throwing away any data. With REST, there's a lot of times we get the responses back, and there might be 10 properties in that DTO, and we only really want 2 of them. So what do? Well, we just throw the other 8 away. But with mobile apps, that's painful because I just burned through your data plan because I have an inefficient REST API endpoint. So with GraphQL, I don't have to worry about that anymore. I get exactly what I want back from the server. And if I want to change the data I get back, I can just modify the query. So again, I don't have to wait on a new API from my backend team. I can just literally change the shape of the response to handle whatever new feature I'm working on in my mobile app. Now, yes, this is a JSON response, but if you look closely, this query is not JSON. It looks kind of like JSON, but if you look a little closer, you'll see there's no double quotes. We don't have the field name, colon, value. This is our query language. So this is where the QL in GraphQL comes in. And I know what you're thinking, like, oh, great. Here, he's been telling me how amazing GraphQL is, but now I got to learn a new language for it. I don't have time for that. Well, don't worry about that. It's actually really easy. And to be honest, I've been using GraphQL for years, and I haven't memorized the query language. So let me show you what that looks like. We can pull up the GitHub's GraphQL API. So what I've done in my browser, I've navigated to, boop. This is GitHub's GraphQL API. So when you navigate to here in your browser, you're greeted with this page called, or this tool rather, called Graphical. It's a clever play on words because it's a graphical user interface for GraphQL, so Graphical. And you get this for free. When you build your GraphQL endpoint, your GraphQL libraries will have this graphical user interface in it. There's a couple of them out there. This one's Graphical. There's another one called GraphQL Playground. There's another one called Banana Cake Pop. But you don't have to worry about building this because it kind of comes with the package. So the first thing I want to show off in Graphical, because this is one of my favorite things about GraphQL, is this Docs tab here. So when I tap on the Docs tab, we'll see it opens up this Documentation Explorer. And this is really cool because GraphQL APIs are self-documenting. So the way GraphQL has to work, or does work, is it already knows all of the objects, classes, fields that it can respond to back to the client. And so these tools like Graphical, like GraphQL Playground, all they do, they just walk through that tree, and then they can provide us with all the documentation for our API. So the GitHub team didn't have to write any docs for this. They don't have, they do. They're still, good developers, I guess. But it's all here in this tool for me. Now, the first thing we see here in this Documentation Explorer, and I'm going to zoom in on it here, is there's 2 root types. These are the same 2 root types that you'll see in every GraphQL backend. The first one being query, and the second one being mutation. Now, a query is essentially a read-only request from the server. It means I want to get data from the server, but I don't want to change any data on the server. So a query you can kind of think of like a GET request, right? We're not changing anything on the back end. We're just requesting data back. We're making a query. A mutation does change something server-side. So that would be the equivalent to our puts, our updates, our deletes in REST. And so because I am logged into GitHub right now, this is live on my GitHub account, we're going to stick to queries today, because I don't want to risk changing anything and breaking any of my projects. And so what I'm going to start doing here is building out the GraphQL query here on the left. And to do it, like I said, you don't have to memorize anything, because it tells us what to type. So I'm going to type in this query with a lowercase q. And right away, as I start typing it, you'll see IntelliSense pops up. So that's pretty cool. You don't even really have to know how to spell it. I mean, I guess you could copy paste it too. But yeah, I'm gonna type in query. And then what this tells me is anytime I make a query to the GraphQL API, it's going to return back this query type or this query object. And so if I click on this query object, now I can see all of the different requests that I can make. So these are all the fields that we can get back from the GitHub API. And if you're familiar with GitHub, a lot of these will probably look familiar. Like I can get information about a GitHub organization. I can get information about a GitHub repository. I can get information about GitHub user. So let's do that. Let's query for a user. And again, I'm just going to type in, whoops, let's go back. Accidental click there. So all I'm going to do is type in what's here on the left again. And so here in my query, I'm going to type in user. IntelliSense, great. Looks like I'm typing everything right. And then it also tells me I have to specify a login. Now, in the GraphQL spec, I mean, there's a couple base types, and you're probably already familiar with things like datetime, string, int, bool. Those are all the base types in GraphQL, and everything builds off of that. But what might look a little funny is this exclamation point. The exclamation point means that it is not nullable. So what this is telling me here is that if for my user login, I have to pass in a string. I can't just ignore that and put in null. So let's bring up that, IntelliSense even finished typing it for me. So for the login, I'm going to put br Minnick. This is my GitHub username. GitHub calls them logins because it is your login, but it's also just my public GitHub username. Login makes it sound like it's something secret I shouldn't be sharing. But right, so now what I've said, I want to query about this user, br Minnick, me, Brandon Minnick. And you'll see I'm still not done yet. There's a little red squiggle here saying that there's a syntax error because it expects more data. I can't just say, give me everything you got on this user, because remember, GraphQL only returns back what we ask for. So if I click on the user object, this is what's going to return from my user query. We can go a layer deeper and see what fields can I get back about a user. And again, if you've used GitHub before, this is probably pretty intuitive that I can get information about like a user's bio. I mean, you can format it in HTML if maybe you're working on a website. That makes it easier. You can see company. What else do we have? Created at. I guess that's the date time I created my GitHub account. There's things like followers. So we can tell it exactly what we want. There we go. And then when I click the execute button, there we go. There's our JSON response. So just like we were talking about earlier, we provide a query saying, here's exactly what I want. I want to know more about this user, br Minnick. I want to know their bio, what company they work at. What else did I request? The date it was created at. Looks like I created my GitHub account in 2015, and the total followers count that they have on GitHub. And that's exactly what we got back. And again, this is just JSON in the response. So it's the same JSON we know and love. We would then deserialize this, consume it in C#. And likewise, let's say I didn't care what what date and time we created my GitHub account. We just delete that. We re-execute this query, and it's magically gone. So we get exactly the data back that we asked for. Now, so again, just take a moment to think about how powerful this is. So from the client side, I can request anything I want. As long as the GraphQL server exposes it, as long as it will send it back to me, I can request that data in any shape I want. I can add more queries here. So we could add another query here about a repository, and we can get all of this information in one round trip, even though some of the information like the followers count, that's nested data. With REST, that would take us 2 round trips because I would have to get information about the user, and then I could ask for information about followers. But with GraphQL, 1 round trip. And it puts the power in the hands of the client, so the API team doesn't have to constantly create more and more REST APIs that only do one thing, because now we have a GraphQL endpoint that does everything. OK, so this is cool, but how does this really work, right? Because we're just in the browser. We're literally on GitHub servers. So like, is this really how we use GraphQL in our apps? No, like we're going to be sending HTTP requests and making, creating payloads. So how do we do that? So to show that off, I'm going to open up a tool called Postman. Now, if you've never heard of it, Postman is just a great tool that's one of my favorites that helps us explore and test out APIs. So anytime I am building out a backend, I'll use Postman to make those GET requests to it, POST requests, to make sure my API is working like I think it should before I start writing code, because then at least I know the API is working and it's my code that's broken. So here in Postman, we're going to make a call to GitHub's GraphQL API. So I've already punched in the URL for GitHub. It's api.github.com/GraphQL. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to set this to be a POST request. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, POST, that's a REST thing. We're talking GraphQL. Well, it turns out every GraphQL request is just a POST request. So if you already know how to make a POST request in C#, you already know how to communicate with a GraphQL API endpoint. So the same way you would create a new HTTP client, send a POST request to your REST API, it's the same POST that we're using for GraphQL. And this is also something I find funny, that if you just Google REST versus GraphQL, you'll see all these wars going back and forth and blog posts like, REST is dead, long live GraphQL. And I'm like, I don't know if you guys know what you're talking about, because GraphQL literally uses REST. It's built on top of the REST protocol. So REST isn't going anywhere, but yeah, I also agree that GraphQL is the future. But anyway, so we set this to be a POST request. And then in our body, we're going to add one field. So the way GraphQL works, we have one field called query, and the value of that field is literally what we just figured out here. So this is literally what I do for my apps. I jump into the GUI on the server, so Graphical in this case. I play around with it till I get my query shaped the way I want it to, and then I just copy paste this. So I'm going to copy this query, and I'm going to paste it in here. And let's see, I'm going to just get rid of some of this white space so it stops yelling at me. Get it all on one line. One more there, and then we also want to keep those quotes. There we go, so no more red squiggles. And so that's it. Just one field called query. I paste in the value of the GraphQL query that I just figured out using Graphical. And then when I send this POST request to the GraphQL API at GitHub, we get back, again, exactly the data I asked for. So again, if you already know how to make a POST request, you can already access GraphQL API endpoints, because it quite literally is the same thing. OK, so I know I've been throwing a lot of stuff at you, so let's do a quick review. GraphQL APIs have one endpoint. So unlike REST, where you have multiple endpoints that each just do one specific thing, with GraphQL, there's just one endpoint that does everything. GraphQL APIs are self-documenting. So because when we create our GraphQL endpoint, you'll see that in just a minute when we jump into the code to create our own GraphQL API, we have to define everything when we create our GraphQL server. And so these tools like Graphical that we were just playing around with, that documentation explorer just walks through the tree and sees all the queries that I've created, and then just exposes that to you as the documentation. So you don't have to worry about necessarily keeping your docs up to date with the API, because the docs are the API. GraphQL requests are just post requests. So they leverage REST's post HTTP method. So again, if you already know how to make a post request, you know how to make a GraphQL request. That GraphQL request it contains JSON in the request body, and that JSON just contains one field query, and to which we just copy paste our GraphQL query. And then that GraphQL response is JSON. So just like REST APIs, GraphQL APIs also return the same JSON that we know and love. Okay, so let's get ready for some code. Now, I do want to highlight the two most popular GraphQL libraries for us in .NET in C#. The first one, I gave it the crown because it's currently the king. It has the most NuGet downloads. It has the most open source contributors. Yep, it's open source on GitHub. It's called GraphQL there we go, .NET. Now this was also the first. So there's a pretty easy explanation to why it has the most downloads, because it's been around the longest. It works really well. I've used it in a couple of my apps, but there's a rising star here, and it's called Hot Chocolate. There's a company based out of Switzerland called Chili Cream that makes hot chocolate. They've got a lot of fun names, and you'll see a couple more later. Hot chocolate is incredible. This is what we're going to use today for our demos. Like I said, it still doesn't have as many NuGet downloads, but it's just because GraphQL.NET came first. So highly recommend Hot Chocolate to you. This is going to be the one we punch into our app today. So let's do it. Let's jump into some code here. I've got Visual Studio for Mac opened up. And again, don't worry about memorizing anything, because this demo is already done. It's already up on GitHub, and I'll make sure to share the link with you before we end. So sit back and relax. We're just going to make an empty ASP.NET Core app. And yeah, let's do it in .NET 6. That sounds good. We'll call it our GraphQL demo. No, thank you. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, we're going to add in that hot chocolate NuGet package. So let's search for hot chocolate. And specifically, there's an ASP.NET Core version or implementation. So let's see, did I pass it? Hot chocolate dot ASP.NET Core, that's authentication. Hot chocolate, let's just try typing in ASP.NET Core. There we go, that's the one we want. So we'll just add in the hotchocolate.ASP.NET Core NuGet package. We'll give this a second to download and add it in. I've noticed this is a pretty substantial NuGet package. It's got a lot of dependencies in it, so sometimes it takes a minute. So to it, while this is working on it, what questions do we have so far about GraphQL? Yes, right here in the front.
How do you handle access control?
Access control. So similar rules apply for REST. So like, for example, the GitHub API, they use bearer tokens. So I just include that in the header. And I did that before the demo because I didn't want to share with you guys my actual bearer token. But yeah, that way it authenticates, it knows it's me. And so, yeah, all that same security that we know with REST is still there. We're still downloading. I think I saw a hand right here. Yes, sir.
So if you have a company which has a lot of teams working on different domains within your application or application area, so how would you consolidate different teams working on different parts of sort of the graph?
Good question. So yeah, just to repeat it for everybody at home, the question was, what if you have, hey, there we go. accept those terms because I don't have a choice. What if we have multiple teams at our company and we all work on different parts of the API? So it sounds like maybe you have different subdomains. Each has its own REST API or set of REST APIs. So you got a couple choices because you can still do that with GraphQL. You don't only have to have one API endpoint. It's easy for me to consume as a user of, say, GitHub, because I just have to point to the one, but internally, does GitHub have maybe a couple or their own internal APIs also built on GraphQL? GraphQL? Probably. So you can split it up like that. You could have your teams each have their own different subdomain. And actually, we'll see in the demo now that we've got this installed how it might get a little messy, but you could still use version control and merge it all into the same place. You'd probably just have to be well-disciplined in your DevOps. So let's keep running with this demo because maybe that'll answer your question. So first things first, has anybody here played with .NET 6 and these minimal APIs yet? Okay, just a couple hands. So this might look a little weird. It was definitely weird to me when I first created this template. When I was getting ready for this demo, I was like, whoa, where's my startup? Where's my configure services method? But after playing around with this for a couple minutes, I love it because this is it. This is an ASP.NET Core app where the template, at least here, has mapped a get API onto the index that if we ran this right now, it would just bring up a web page that says hello world. So we're going to keep running with this because I think as we go, you'll pick up kind of where this might go in the old ASP.NET Core templates. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to add GraphQL to our services. So I just come in here and I say add GraphQL server. And then I'm going to chain a method to it that says add query type. And we haven't created a query yet, so I'm going to actually leave this empty. It'll give me a red squiggle, but hopefully that'll be a good reminder to come back to it. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to add in our GraphQL endpoint. So to do that, we'll say app.useRouting, and then we'll say use endpoints. And the hot chocolate library gives us this handy dandy map GraphQL method. So again, with what did I just do? Technically 2 lines of code, but they're on 3 different lines. That's basically it. We've set up our GraphQL server. This map GraphQL method, if we cheat a little bit and zoom in on IntelliSense, we can get a sense of what it's doing. It's just giving us the /GraphQL endpoint. So once we keep building our models and build out this API and launch it in the browser, I just go to /GraphQL, and that's my GraphQL API endpoint. Okay, so what do we want to build today? Well, the kind of canonical hello world demo in GraphQL is kind of building a library. So let's create some books. So I'm going to use records. Keep this code nice and concise. So I'm going to say public record book, and each book has a string title. And we'll say public record author, and each author will have a name, and also each book is going to have an author as well. So these are going to be my 2 data types that we're going to be playing around with. And now we can build out that query that belongs up here where the red squiggles are. So I'm going to create a class called query. And normally, if we were building this ourselves for our real apps, we would be pointing to production data, right? We've got a database somewhere that we can point to pull the data out, but I don't have that. I mean, I guess we could. I could have set that up ahead of time, but why don't we just make some dummy data here? So we'll just make a list of books, and let's make up some books here. So let's create a book called, how about I Love GraphQL, and authored by me, Brandon Minnick, because I love GraphQL. We can create another book. We'll say GraphQL is the future. And I also said that, so let's attribute that one to me. And then let's create one more book. And let's call this one like, I love soap and XML by this other author. Let's say his name is probably John. I hate new technology. Doe. There we go. And what do we miss? Oh, I see it. Comma, parenthesis, no more red squiggles? All right. Okay, so that's just going to be our dummy data. Like I said, if we're building this for real, we'd be pointing our GraphQL queries to our actual production data. But speaking of those queries, what do they look like? Well, I'm going to build one called books. So this one will just return a list of books. And I'm going to call it getBooks. And not surprisingly, we're just going to point to our books data. So this, again, normally point to maybe our entity framework. Or actually what's really cool is, let's say you have, this is also a great answer for your question. Let's say you already have a lot of existing REST APIs. Well, a lot of companies nowadays are doing, because let's be honest, we put a lot of investment into our existing backends, right? We don't want to just throw them out and redo them. So what you can do, you can actually build a GraphQL endpoint that points to the REST APIs. So essentially, you can put GraphQL in front, get all the GraphQL goodies, so fewer round trips, being able to query whatever data you want, and you can just point it to, maybe you already have a getBooks REST API, so we can just point it to there, and then GraphQL will use that to consume the data, which is really cool. Okay, let's just start with this one query for now called getBooks, and I named this class query, so let's put that in here, get rid of those red squiggles, and let's run it and see what happens. So if I did everything right, we'll launch the browser. We'll see Edge pop up here in a second. Great. So there's the hello world that came with the template. But what I'm going to do is go to /GraphQL to access our GraphQL endpoint. And so just like how we were in Graphical earlier, I mentioned that there's a couple of these GraphQL GUIs. Banana Cake Pop is the one that comes with hot chocolate. So when you start playing around with these tools from the company called Chili Cream, they've got a lot of fun names, like Hot Chocolate is the GraphQL server, Strawberry Shake is the name of their client-side GraphQL implementation, and then we've got Banana Cake Pop here for the graphical user interface. And it'll take a second to spin up because it's actually trying to communicate back to a server. Because what you can do with Banana Cake Pop is you can log into it, meaning basically you can create a profile, save your queries. And so we'll just give this a second to keep spinning. It'll show up in a second, and then once it's loaded, it's loaded. We won't have to do that again. But come on, conference Wi-Fi. Well, I'll tell you what. I saw another hand, I think, around here when we were asking questions earlier. We can do another question while we're waiting for Banana Cake Pop. Maybe not. All right.
Can I show the code again?
Oh, yeah, of course. So again, that GraphQL server configuration, we're saying add GraphQL server to our service collection. We're adding that query type. And you know what? Like I named it query. It doesn't have to be named query. Like I could have named this library query. The name kind of just means nothing. It's just the name of our class that Hot Chocolate's going to use to consume. It looks like it's taking a while. Let's see if I can, if I go in private, if that'll clear some cache. Or maybe I'll leave it both up and we'll have a little race here. Maybe we'll try it in Safari. We'll have oh, there it is. Okay. In private. Look at that. Nice and quick. Okay. So we can get rid of Safari. No, thank you. All right. So once this loads, we just connect it to this GraphQL endpoint. Hopefully that'll turn green. It does. This is one of my favorite things with Banana Cake Pop, and it's so silly, but I love it. If you hover your mouse over the chili cream logo, he says hello. So anyways, back to the GraphQL goodness. So, right, in the code, we created a library query, and we've only created one query so far. So this is one that's going to return our books. So if I start typing in query, we get that IntelliSense just like we expect. And look at that. There's our books query. And let's see. OK, great. There it is. If we zoom in here, this tells us that the books query returns a list of books. So the way this GraphQL nomenclature works is the square brackets tell us that it's a list. So it's a list of type book. And then again, the exclamation point means it's not nullable. So there's two exclamation points here. One on the outside of the list says the list will never be nullable. So at worst, I'll get an empty list back. And then inside of that list will be books that are also not nullable. So I'll never get a null book back. And so just like you can probably guess, we can query for books. And inside the books, there's our title that we created. So the title is a string, which is also not nullable. And also we can get the author and get the author's name. And just like you expect, when we click run, we get our JSON response back. So in just a couple lines of code, we've stood up a GraphQL server. And if we already have existing data points or REST APIs, we could just point our GraphQL queries to those REST APIs. And really quickly, we can have a GraphQL endpoint that we can use. Because again, the cool thing with GraphQL is like, maybe I don't care about the title of the books. I just want to know the authors. We can get that back. Now, one of the cool things I like about Hot Chocolate is the reason it knows that nothing was nullable is because it uses C# nullability. So if you remember in C# 8, C# 9, what are we on now? This is 10. So recently in C#, they came out with nullable where we could say book might be null. So if I update my data set here to say book is now nullable, that gives me the opportunity to pass in a null value. And if I were to rebuild this and run it again, and so here I just need to reconnect to the GraphQL API. And if I type in my query, now if I zoom in on book no longer has the exclamation point because a book could be null. So the list still can't be null because I didn't make the list nullable, but just by using nullable in C#, Hot Chocolate automatically translates that to us. So if we ask for the list of books again, author, name, there we go. We should see one at the end. Null. So pretty cool. Now, what we can do, we can expand on this a little bit. We've got some time. So what if we wanted to just get back one book? So let's say we want to get one book back. We'll call that get book. And to do that, that means somebody's got to give us something. So let's filter by the title. So to get a title from our books back, we'll say books dot, we'll say first or default, since maybe they give us a title that doesn't exist. And we'll just compare the book's title to the title they gave us. And we'll bring that down so we can all see it. There we go. And so again, rerun this. And once that's running, just reconnect to my GraphQL server. Come back up, create a new query, look at our IntelliSense, and there it is. So now we have a book type. So we can call that book query. And just like we expect, that book requires a title. So in here, I would say title, I love GraphQL. And then again, we can't just get all the data back from the book because GraphQL wants us to specify the fields that we want. So I'll say, yep, I want to know, even though I gave the title, you can tell me the title again. And then we'll run it, and we get our book back. So let's see. Why don't we do one more? just for fun, because we could also do something on the authors. Now, even though we don't have, and we'll say an authors database, we have a books database, we're just using C#, right? So we can just take advantage of the fact that this is linked, so we can get books, and let's see, yeah, that author should probably be null just in case they give us one back, and we'll filter on that. So wherever the books, the book's author, we want to know, they got to give us the author's name though. So the author name equals name. Bring that on one line again. And then we'll say, if it exists, give me the first one. If not, that's okay. And that's nullable. Getting red squiggles, book to author. Oh, because I got to select author now. So get a nice, nasty, beautiful link query. That's yelling at me because that's nullable too. We'll rerun that. And there we go. Reconnect to the GraphQL API. Maybe. Maybe not. Oh, it crashed on me, huh? What did I do wrong? Get author. Wonder if my cert expired. Fatal error, debugging needs to be terminated. I'll just build the same code again. That's the best way to do it, right? Oh, there it is. It's already in use. It's in use because you crashed on me. Now, anyways, so let's see. Actually, let's see if it's actually in use, because we could actually open up Postman, just like we were doing earlier with the GitHub API. Make a post request. In that body, put in some JSON, boop, and say query, let's say books, title. Let's see if this works. No, it really did crash on me. Well, dang. So I did want to end with one more little cool trick here in Postman. Let's see, since our server crashed on us, let's jump back to this GitHub example we were looking at earlier. Because there's something cool that Postman's also added. This was not around when I first learned how to use GraphQL, but there's actually this GraphQL button here. And so instead of putting in our raw JSON and having to remember what was that syntax again? That field's called query, and then I paste the query, but do I still that include query? What you can do, you can click this GraphQL option here in Postman, and I'm just going to cheat. I'm going to go back to the GitHub Explorer and copy paste. And so I can just copy in that raw GraphQL query into Postman, click send, and there we go. And we get that same data back. So, if you haven't gotten a chance yet, this is where you can find everything that we covered today. So make sure to grab a picture of this with your phone, bookmark it. You can share it with your colleagues, share it with your friends that couldn't be here today. Help them to get up to speed on GraphQL, because this is where you can find the slides. I'll be posting a link to the recording once NDC's got it up. The open source demo that we just did, I've already got that saved in GitHub and linked on the website here for you as well, along with, let's see, Chili Cream has a hot chocolate workshop. I've got a link to that there, as well as links to the Chili Cream docs, links to more about REST versus GraphQL, and just a lot of helpful resources that were really good and helpful to me when I was learning GraphQL. So hopefully they'll be helpful for you as well. Thank you. Okay, so we do have about 5 minutes left. Happy to answer questions. You're also welcome to hit the road if you want, but I'll be here. I'll also be floating around the conference for the rest of the day too, if anybody wants to chat. So yeah, what questions do you have about what we chatted about here in GraphQL? Yes.
web services from third-party providers?
Oh, good question. So the question was, does it make sense to use GraphQL for your database, or if you're fetching data from other web providers, does that also make sense? I'll say yes, mostly. Assuming those other web providers don't have latency concerns or rate limiting, throttling concerns, especially if you own them. So kind of like we were talking about earlier, a lot of companies that they'll just keep their existing REST APIs and then they'll just build GraphQL on top of that. And GraphQL will just, so for their books, they probably already had a book API for the library. And so they're just pointing to that. And then that already knows how to get the books. So yeah, you can absolutely use it for web services. But yeah, just keep in mind, it's not going to be a magic wand. So if those web services have like throttling, rate limiting, or they go down all the time, then that's just going to trickle back up through your GraphQL endpoint. Good question, though. What other questions? Yes?
Are there a way to know which fields from the database are actually queried from the GraphQL so you don't have to...
Great question. So the question was, is there a way that we can specify which fields are exposed from the database? Because, yeah, we don't want to be able, like, exposing passwords or any sensitive user information.
No, that wasn't the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Part of the question. If I'm to query a database for, let's say, 10 fields, but the data model has 100, is there a way to limit what's actually retrieved from the database based on the query? If you ask for book's name only, it doesn't make sense to load all the other fields from the database.
Right. So good question. I'm not sure if Hot Chocolate has any of that optimization built into it. And again, just to repeat that question, it was like, what if I only want to know the name or the title of the book, but in the database, we've got everything about, the author, the year it was written, the copyright information, but we don't care about all that. So could we just make it so the database query itself only returns back the title? I know there's a way to do it. I'm not sure if we manually have to specify that, like if maybe we do a link query that is more unique to that, or if there's a generic way of doing it. But I know it is doable, because I know that's also one of the big benefits of GraphQL. So a common question I'll get is, well, we're already using OData, so why should I switch to GraphQL? Because OData filters the data, right? And it's like, yeah, I mean, kind of. Like, that's one feature of GraphQL that OData is similar with. But yeah, with OData, it's still going to make that full database query. It just filters the data that leaves and comes back. So you don't get the performance gains. And I know with GraphQL, you can. But do I know how to do it off the top of my head? I don't. So good question, but definitely something to look into. And yeah, I'm actually interested in maybe Hot Chocolate has a way to do that built in. Because like I said, it is the best. And Hot Chocolate, by the way, is also part of the GraphQL Foundation. So just like we were talking about earlier with these foundations and not-for-profits and making sure these libraries stick around, because they're a member of the GraphQL, or because they're a member of the .NET Foundation, you can feel safe and secure knowing that if you use Hot Chocolate for your APIs, that it's not going anywhere. They're not pulling the plug on anytime soon. Is that 1 minute left? Okay, cool. Yeah, we do have 1 minute left. I think I saw one more hand. We can also chat afterwards. That works too. All right, well, thanks again, everybody, and hopefully I'll see you around the rest of the day.